Hello, my name is Bryce Hunter, and today I will be comparing the conquest of the Native Americans and slavery in the American South. Throughout history, many forms of terrorism have evolved in different ways. Terrorism is defined as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Throughout this course, we have learned about ancient terrorism all the way to modern terrorism. And there are two case studies that I have found more commonalities than any other in my mind. The two that I have decided to compare are the conquest and destruction of Native American societies and the American South, slavery and segregation. Slavery and the conquest of the Native Americans are comparable because in both instances, they are oppressing another race that they believe to have superiority over. Although they happened 5 centuries apart, they have many parallels that can be directly and indirectly compared. The conquest and destruction of Native American societies, specifically in the Greater Antilles, happened throughout the early 1500s through the 1550s. Most of these countries that were getting discovered and conquered were by explorers out of Spain, such as Ponce de Leon, Diego Velázquez, and Christopher Columbus. The discoveries of these islands came along with the discovery of Native Americans. And at first, their relationships were not all that bad. When the Spanish entered the Caribbean islands and the southern parts of America, they introduced slavery to these parts of the world. They also tried to teach Indians to become Christians, but later ruled that they were not smart enough, and this is when relations between the two started to go downhill. The American slavery in the South began when the Europeans in the Southern and Caribbean colonies turned to the transatlantic slave trade instead of using indentured whites. Once the slaves got to America, they began to get bought by wealthy white plantation owners who would have them work as farmers of sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton. Through the slave economy, according to Greg Timmons, a writer and historian for History.com, quote, if the Confederacy had been a separate nation, it would have ranked as the fourth richest in the world at the start of the Civil War, end quote. The slaves were mistreated, and many slaves had died due to poor living conditions, whether it was disease or starvation. These two are alike and unlike in many ways, such as their attempts to rationalize their behavior and terrorist acts. Although the conquest of Native Americans involved Columbus and many others traveling to the Americas and instilling fear into the natives, and slavery and oppression involved bringing of slaves to America, they both tried to justify what they were doing. The figures who traveled to the Americas and wiped out many of the Native Americans believed they were doing good by exporting Catholicism to foreign lands. They also tried to justify their actions by installing a government and trying to teach the natives to be more like them. As the settlement of the Americas by the Spaniards was said to be justified, the slave owners in the South also tried to justify their actions. The slave owners in the American South tried to justify their actions by using the slaves to farm certain types of agricultures that no one else wanted to. The slave owners also argued that the slaves were subordinates to them and that they deserved to be in these conditions because of their skin color. Lastly, slavery was justified to be social Darwinism and basically natural selection. As you can see, both of these forms were attempted to be justified by both groups that definitely instilled fear into these groups of people that were not deserving of their treatment. The slaves of the South, as well as the Native Americans that were conquered by the Spaniards, were both marginalized in different ways, but we are able to draw certain comparisons about their brutal treatment. The slaves of the South were oppressed by getting taken away from their homeland, while the Native Americans had their homeland taken over and they were forced out of it. Another indirect comparison is the spread of disease between both the slaves and the Native Americans. The slaves of the South had had such poor living conditions on the ships that brought them across the Atlantic, as well as their living conditions once they landed in the Americas, that they started to become diseased and many of them died. Although the Native Americans did not travel across the Atlantic, those who traveled from Europe brought many diseases along, and those diseases almost wiped out the entire Native American population. Throughout all of the oppression that both of these groups went through, both of them have one thing in common, and that is that neither group has truly bounced back from where they were before their oppression. The slaves of Africa were bought and sold so much that it led to their country becoming a huge war zone because of all the weapons traded. Africa has also become very politically unstable because of the slave trade, and wars are still being fought by rebellious groups to try and take over. Although the Native Americans are not fighting a war, they got everything taken away from them and are now living on reserves in America. Another huge effect of colonization had on the Native Americans is that they were forced to adopt new religious beliefs, and this changed their culture forever. As a result of both of the European colonizations of the Americas and the Southern slave trade, both groups had many people die, and they will remember the way they were mistreated for the rest of eternity. Thank you for watching. Here is a list of my citations.